Back at the house, I went straight to my shed. I left the rifle checked by the war bag and put its straps over my head, trying to waste string quickly. I locked the shed again and jogged as far as the bridge while I got my breath back. Once through the narrow gate in the middle of the bridge, I sprinted. At the rabbit grounds, everything was as I'd left it. The buck line strangled in the broken catapult, and the sand kicked up and messed where I'd gone crashing. The wind still moved the grass and flowers, and there were no animals around. Even the gulls hadn't spotted the carrion yet. I got straight to work. First, I took a 20-centimeter electric piping bomb out of the war bag. I slit the buck in the anus. I checked that the bomb was still all right, especially that the white crystals of the explosive mixture were dry, then added a plastic straw fuse and a charge of the explosive round in the hole bored in the still warm rabbit, and left it sort of sitting, squatting, looking towards the holes in the bank. Then I took some smaller bombs and planted them inside some of the rabbit holes, stamping down the roofs of the tunnel entrances so that they caved in and left only the straw fuses sticking out. I filled the plastic detergent bottle and primed the lighter, left it lying on the top of the bank most of the rabbit holes were in, then went back to the first of the blocked holes and lit the fuse with the disposable cigarette lighter. The smell of burning plastic stayed in my nose, and the bright glare of the burning mixture danced in my eyes as I hurried to the next hole, glancing at my watch as I did so. I'd placed 6 smaller bombs and had them all lit in 40 seconds. I was sitting on the top of the bank above the holes, the lighter of the flamethrower burning weakly in the sunlight. Then just over the minute and the first tunnel blew, I felt it through the seat of my pants and grinned. The rest went off quickly, the puff of smoke from the charge around the mouth of each bomb bursting out of its fuming earth just before the main charge went off. Scattering earth was blasted out into the rabbit grounds, and the thudding noises rolled through the air. I smiled at that. There was very little noise, really. You wouldn't have been able to hear a thing back at the house. Almost all the energy from the bombs had gone into blowing the earth out and the air in the burrows back. The first dazed rabbits came out, 2 of them bleeding at the nose, looking otherwise unharmed but staggering, almost falling. I squeezed the plastic bottle and sent a jet of petrol out of it, over the wick of the lighter, held a few centimeters out from the nozzle by the aluminum tent peg. The petrol burst into flames as it flew over the wick in a tiny steel cup, roared through the air, and fell brightly on and around the 2 rabbits. They took flame and blazed, running and stumbling and falling. I looked around for more as the first 2 flamed near the center of the grounds, finally collapsing into the grass, stiff-limbed but twitching, crackling to the breeze. A tiny lick of flame flickered around the mouth of the thrower. I blew it out. Another smaller rabbit appeared. I caught it with the jet of the flame, and it zipped off out of range, heading for the water by the side of the hill. The savage buck had attacked the hill where the savage buck had attacked me. I dug into the war bag, drew out an air pistol, cocked it, and fired it in one movement. The shot missed, and the rabbit trailed a thread of smoke around the hill. I got another 3 rabbits with the thrower before I packed it in. The last thing I did was to fire the blazing stream of petrol at the buck, still sitting stuffed and dead and oozing blood on the forefront of the grounds. The fire dropped all around it so that it disappeared into the rolling orange and curling black. In a few seconds, the fuse caught, and after about 10 seconds, the mass of flame blew up and out, throwing something black and smoking 20 meters or more into the late afternoon air and scattering pieces all over the grounds. The explosion, much bigger than the ones in the holes, and with almost nothing to muffle it, cracked across the dunes like a whip, setting my ears ringing and making even me jump a bit. Whatever was left of the buck landed way behind me. I followed the smell of the burning to where it lay. It was mostly the head and a grubby stub of spine and ribs, and about half the skin. About half the skin. I gritted my teeth and picked up the warm remnant, took it back to the grounds, and flung it into them from the top of the bank. I stood in the slanting sunlight, warm and yellow around me, the stench of burning flesh and grass on the wind, the smoke rising into the air from burrows and cadavers, gray and black, the sweet smell of leaking, unburned petrol coming from the flamethrower where I'd left it, and I breathed deeply. With the last of the petrol, I covered the body of the catapult and used up the bottle of the bottle of the thrower where they lay in the sand, and set fire to them. I sat cross-legged just by the blaze, staring into it from upwind until it was out and only the metal of the black destroyer remained. Then I took the sooty skeleton and buried it where it had been ruined. Where it had been ruined at the bottom. It would have a name now, Black Destroyer Hill. The fire was out everywhere, the grass too young and moist to catch. Not that I'd have cared if it had gone up. I considered setting the wind bushes alight, but the flowers always looked cheerful when they came out, and the bushes smelled better fresh than burned, so I didn't. I decided I'd caused enough mayhem for one day. The catapult was avenged. The buck, or what it meant, its spirit maybe, soiled and degraded, taught a hard lesson, and I felt good. If the rifle was all right and hadn't got sand inside the sights or anywhere else awkward to clean, it would almost have been worth it. The defense budget would stand buying another catapult tomorrow. My crossbow would just have to wait another week or so. With that lovely, sated feeling inside me, I packed the war bag and went wearily home, thinking what had happened over in my mind, trying to figure out the whys and wherefores, seeing what lessons were to be learned, what signs to be read in it all. On the way, I passed the rabbit I thought had escaped, lying just before the sparkling clean water of the stream, blackened and contoured, locked into a weird twisted crouch, its dead dry eyes staring at me as I passed by, accusatory. I kicked it into the water. My other dead uncle was called Harmsworth Stove. a half-uncle from Eric's mother's side of the family. He was a businessman in Belfast, and his wife looked after Eric for nearly 5 years, when my brother was a toddler. Harmsworth committed suicide, eventually with an electric power drill and a quarter-inch bit. He inserted it through the side of his skull, and finding that he was still alive, although in some pain, drove to a nearby hospital where he later died. Actually, I might just have had a little to do with his death, as it occurred less than a year after the Stoves lost their only child, Esmeralda. Unknown to them, and to everyone else, for that matter, she was one of my victims. I lay in bed that night waiting for my father to return and for the phone to ring, while I thought about what had happened. Maybe the big buck was a rabbit from outside the grounds. Some wild beast came into the warren from beyond to terrorize the locals and make itself boss, only to die in an encounter with a superior being it could have no real comprehension of. Whatever, it was a sign, and I was sure of that. The whole fraught episode must signify something. My automatic response might have had something to do with the fire that the factory had predicted, but deep inside I knew it wasn't all there was to it, and there was more to come. The sign was the whole thing, not just the unexpected ferocity of the buck I'd killed, but also in the furious, almost unthinking response and the fate of the innocent rabbits who took the brunt of the wrath. It also meant something looking back as well as forward. The first time I murdered, it was because of rabbits meeting a fiery death, and meeting that fiery death from the nozzle of a flamethrower virtually identical to the one I had used to exact my revenge on the Warren. It was all too much, all too close and perfect. Events were shaping up faster and worse than I could ever expected. I was in danger of losing control of the situation. The rabbit grounds, that supposed happy hunting ground, had shown it could happen. From the smaller to the greater, the patterns always hold true, and the factory has taught me to watch out for them and respect them. That was the first time I killed because of what my cousin Blythe Caldame had done to our rabbits, Eric's and mine. It was Eric who first invented the flamethrower, and it was lying in what was then the bicycle shed, now my shed. When our cousin, who had come to spend the weekend with us along with his parents, decided it would be fun to ride Eric's bike into the soft mud at the south end of the island. This he duly did with Eric and I were out flying. He duly did while Eric and I were out flying kites. Then he came back and filled the flamethrower with petrol. He sat on the back garden with it, obscured from the windows of the lounge where his parents and our father sat. By the washing blowing in the breeze, he lit the thrower and sprayed our two hutches with flame, incinerating all our beauties. Eric, in particular, was very upset. He cried like a girl. I wanted to kill Blythe there and then. The hiding he got from his father, my dad's brother James, was not enough as far as I was concerned. Not for what he'd done to Eric, my brother. Eric was inconsolable, desperate with grief because he had made the thing Blythe had used to destroy our beloved pets. He always was a bit sentimental, always the sensitive one, the bright one, until his nasty experience everybody was sure he would go far. Anyway, that was the start of the school grounds, the area, the big old partially earthed over dune behind the house where all our pets went when they died. The burned rabbits started that. Old Saul was there before them, but that was just a one-off thing. I hadn't said anything to anybody, even Eric, about what I wanted to do to Blythe. I was wise in my childishness even then, at the tender age of 5, when most children are forever telling their parents and friends what they hate, that they hate them and that they wish they were dead. I kept quiet. When Blythe came back the next year, he was even more unpleasant than before, having lost his left leg from above the knee in a road accident. The boy he was playing chicken with was killed. Blythe resented his handicap bitterly. He was 10 by that time and very active. He tried to pretend that the nasty pink thing he had to strap on didn't exist and that it had nothing to do with him. He could just about ride a bike and liked wrestling and playing football, usually in goal. I was just 6 then, and while Blythe knew that I had had some sort of little accident when I was much younger, I certainly seemed to him to be a lot more able-bodied than he was. He thought it was great fun to throw me about and wrestle with me and punch and kick me. I made a convincing show of joining in all this horseplay and appeared to enjoy it hugely for a week or so, while I thought about what I could do to our cousin. My other brother and full brother, Paul, was still alive at the time. He, Eric, and I were supposed to keep Blythe entertained. We did our best, taking Blythe to our favorite places, letting him play with our toys and playing games with him. Eric and I had to restrain him at times when he wanted to do something like throw little Paul into the water to see if he'd float, or like when he wanted to fell a tree over the railway line that goes through Port Neal. But as a rule, we got on surprisingly well, even though it rankled to see Eric, who was the same age as Blythe, obviously in fear of him. So one day, very hot and insecty, with the faint breeze coming in off the sea, we were all lying on the grass on a flat area just to the south of the house. Paul and Blythe had fallen asleep, and Eric was lying with his hands behind his neck, staring drowsily up at the bright blue. Blythe had taken off the hollow plastic leg and left it lying tangled in his straps along the grass blades. I watched Eric fall slowly asleep, his head gently tipping to one side, eyes closed. I got up and went for a walk, ended up at the bunker. It hadn't assumed the full importance it later would in my life, though I already liked the place and felt at home in its coolness and dark. It was an old concrete pillbox built just before the last war to house a gun covering the Firth. It was stuck in the sand like a big gray tooth. I went inside and found the snake. It was an adder. I didn't see it for ages because I was too busy sticking an old rotten fence post out through the slits of the pillbox, pretending it was a gun and firing at imaginary ships. It was only after I'd stopped doing that and gone into the corner to have a piss that I looked over into the other corner, there was a pile of rusty cans and old bottles. There I saw the jagged stripes of the sleeping snake. I decided what I was going to do almost immediately. I went outside quietly, found a length of driftwood of the appropriate shape, came back to the bunker, caught the snake by the neck with the piece of wood, and bundled it into the first rusty can I could find, which still had a lid. I don't think the snake had fully wakened up when I caught it, and I was careful not to jar it as I ran back to where my brothers and Blythe were laying on the grass. Eric had rolled over and had one hand under his head, the other over his eyes. His mouth was open slightly, and his chest moved slowly. Paul lay in the sunlight, curled up in a little ball, quite still, and Blythe was lying on his stomach, hands under his cheek, the stump of his left leg drawn up in the flowers and grass, sticking out from his shorts like some monstrous erection. I went closer, still clutching the rusty can in my shadow. The gable end of the house looked down on us from about 50 meters away, windowless. White sheets flapped feebly in the back garden. My heart beat wildly, and I licked my lips. I sat down by the side of Blythe, careful not to let my shadow cross his face. I put one ear to the can and held it still. I couldn't hear or feel the snake stir. I reached for Blythe's artificial leg, lying smooth and pink by the small of his back and his shadow. I held the leg to the can, took the lid away, sliding the leg over the hole as I did so. Then I slowly turned the can and the leg up the other way, so that the can was over the leg. I shook the can and felt the snake fall into the leg. It didn't like it at first and moved and beat against the sides of the plastic and the neck of the can while I held it and sweated. Oh, I guess he was sweating. Listening to the hum of the insects and the rustling of the grass, staring at Blythe as he lay still and silent, his dark hair ruffled now and again by the breeze. My hand shook and the perspiration ran into my eyes. The snake stopped moving. I held it longer, glancing at the house again. Then I tipped the leg and the can over until the leg was lying at the same angle on the grass as it had been behind Blythe. I took the can carefully away at the last moment. Nothing happened. The snake was still inside the leg, and I couldn't even see it. I got up, walked backwards towards the nearest dune, threw the can way high over the top of it, then came back, lay down where I'd been sitting earlier, and closed my eyes. Eric woke first. Then I opened my eyes, though sleepily, and we woke little Paul and our cousin. Blythe saved me the trouble of suggesting a game of football by doing it himself. Eric, Paul, and I got the goalposts together while Blythe hurriedly strapped on his leg. Nobody suspected from the first moments when my brothers and I stood there incredulous as Blythe screamed and jumped and tugged at his leg to the tearful farewell of Blythe's parents and Diggs taking statements. A bit even appeared in Iverness Courier, which was picked up for its curiosity value by a couple of the Fleet Street regs. Not one person even suggested that it might have been anything other than a tragic and slightly macabre accident. Only I knew better.